Laura's fingers trembled as they brushed against the edge of the folded paper in Mark's desk drawer. For a moment she just stared at it, her mind racing. Should I? Shouldn't I? She had no idea what she was looking for, but something inside her told her this piece of paper could change everything. The drawer had always been a place of hidden things, papers, receipts, random trinkets, but never anything of consequence. Until now. With a deep breath, she opened it. Her eyes scanned the bold letters on the page, each word piercing her chest like a needle. DNA test results. The coldness of the words hit her like a slap to the face. Her mind struggled to comprehend, but there was no denying the truth glaring back at her. Mark had been cheating on her, and there was a child that wasn't hers. Her breath caught in her throat as the world seemed to tilt around her. How could he do this? How could Mark, her husband, the man she had spent years with, the father of her children, betray her so completely? The paper fluttered from her hands, drifting to the floor like a lifeless thing, but Laura was too numb to care. She stood there, her body frozen in the suffocating silence of the room. Outside, the rain began to fall. Hard, relentless. Just like the storm inside me, Laura thought bitterly. Her pulse raced, every beat echoing in her ears. She had thought they were solid, unbreakable, but now, with one cruel revelation, everything had shattered. The rain lashed against the windows, a chaotic symphony that mirrored the storm in Laura's chest. She leaned against the desk, feeling her legs threaten to give way beneath her. How long had he been doing this? The questions flooded her mind, each one more painful than the last. Mark had always been distant. There were signs, little cracks in their relationship that she had tried to ignore. But this was the truth. And it was inescapable. How could he betray me this way? Tears welled in her eyes, but she held them back. She couldn't let herself cry yet. Not now. She needed to think, to process, to act. She turned toward the window, her gaze distant, watching the rain pour down in sheets, as though the world itself was mourning with her. But as the storm outside raged, Laura felt the smallest flicker of something new within her, a spark of resolve. It all began to make sense now. The late nights, the business trips that always seemed to fall at the worst times, the way he would brush off her questions, dismissing her suspicions as if they were nothing. Lies, every last one of them. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, dragging her under with it, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Mark had been lying for so long that he'd convinced himself it was normal. But now, the lies were exposed, and everything that had once been a part of her everyday life was crumbling before her eyes. What was I to him? She wondered bitterly. A convenience? A cover for his real life? As the storm raged outside, memories of their marriage flashed before Laura's eyes. There had been moments of love, yes, but also moments of distance, of tension. When had it all started? When had the cracks first appeared? The quiet dinners where they both sat on their phones. The nights spent apart in the same house. She had convinced herself that it was just the pressures of life. Work, children, responsibilities. But now, looking back, she saw it clearly. Mark had been slipping away long before she ever knew. Every sweet word he had whispered to her, every touch he had given her, it all felt hollow now, a facade. The man she had loved was an illusion. A stranger had been hiding behind his face. Laura's grief began to shift, morphing into something harder, more dangerous. I need to know everything. The thought surged in her mind like a mantra. The pain was still raw, still ripping through her, but beneath it was a cold, calculated determination. She needed to understand how deep this betrayal went. Her hands shook, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was anger. Pure, unrelenting anger. He has to pay for this. I will make sure of it. The idea of confronting him, of asking him questions, felt too passive now. No, she needed to uncover every detail herself. She would not give him the satisfaction of hiding the truth from her any longer. Laura's breath came in shallow bursts as she stared at the paper on the floor. Confronting Mark now wouldn't help her. Not when she was still reeling from the shock. She needed more. She needed proof. She had to be sure. I won't let him manipulate me anymore, not this time. She stood there, her body tense, her mind sharp as a blade. She wouldn't let him know that she knew. Not yet. She would gather the pieces, build her case. She would be the one holding all the cards when the time came. He's underestimated me, Laura thought, her lips curling into a cold smile. She had always trusted Mark, always believed in him. But that trust had been a lie. A carefully crafted illusion, just like everything else. Now, it was time for her to play the game. Let him think he's still in control. Let him think I'm still the same trusting wife. He won't know what hit him. As she began to gather the pieces of Mark's hidden life, Laura felt something stir deep inside her. Something she hadn't felt in years. Power, control, revenge. It was a dangerous path to walk, but she knew there was no turning back now. Laura Williams had always prided herself on being kind-hearted. A dedicated schoolteacher, she had a natural warmth about her that made every student feel welcome, every parent comfortable. At 34, she should have been in the prime of her life, vibrant, energetic, with a husband she loved and 2 children she cherished. Instead, she found herself in a marriage that was slowly eroding her soul. The love she had once shared with Mark was no longer a fire that kept her warm. It was a flicker of a flame, barely visible under the weight of years of neglect. Laura often found herself staring at Mark across their dinner table, wondering when it had all changed. When had the conversation stopped? When had the laughter faded? She could remember when he would reach for her hand or bring her a cup of tea in the morning, just because. Now it seemed like their marriage had become an arrangement, a habit, empty, mechanical. Her heart ached as she sat in her quiet living room, the hum of the television in the background, but Mark's attention elsewhere. Where did the man I married go, she thought. Mark Williams on the surface was the perfect husband. At 36, he had the looks, the charm, and the job that everyone envied. As a successful real estate agent, he was always on the go. Always. In meetings, always with clients. He wore his success like a shield, one that hid the cracks in his personal life. Charismatic and seemingly devoted to his family, Mark knew exactly how to make people feel seen, how to make them believe that he was everything they could ever want. But behind his charming smile and tailored suits, Mark was living a double life. He had learned how to juggle the demands of his career, the facade of his family life, and a secret affair. He told himself it was just something he needed, something to fill the void that had long since grown between him and Laura. He told himself that he wasn't hurting anyone, that his 2 worlds could remain separate. But as time went on, the balance became harder to maintain. And Claire, his mistress, had no idea that he was starting to slip. No idea that the lies he told her were beginning to unravel. Claire Miller had never imagined herself as a mistress. She had always been the kind of person who believed in love. True, honest love. But life had never been kind to her. A single mother in her early 30s, Claire struggled to make ends meet. Her son Leo was the only constant in her life, the only person who mattered. But when Mark came into her life, his charm made her feel seen for the first time in a long while. His promises, of a future, of stability, of love, were seductive, and for a moment, they made her forget the loneliness that had been her constant companion. But now she found herself trapped between hope and despair. Mark's promises were starting to feel empty, his texts less frequent, his calls colder. Still, she clung to the belief that somehow things would change. She wanted to believe in the future he had painted for her, even as the reality of their relationship began to feel like a dream that was slipping through her fingers. Ellie had been Laura's best friend for as long as she could remember. They had met in college, bonded over shared experiences, and had always been there for each other. Ellie was the kind of person who knew how to listen, really listen, and Laura often found herself pouring out her heart to her, seeking advice, seeking comfort. It was Ellie who had noticed first. "You're different," Ellie had said one evening, looking at Laura over their glasses of wine. "What's going on with you and Mark?" Laura hadn't had an answer then, but the question had stuck with her. Ellie was no fool. She could see the cracks in Laura's marriage long before Laura had been willing to admit it to herself. And when the storm hit, Ellie would be there to help her pick up the pieces. Detective Harris was a seasoned investigator with a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of justice. He had seen it all: cheating spouses, lies, betrayal. But Laura's case would test everything he believed about human nature. When the investigation began, he would be forced to confront the depths of deception in ways he never expected. But for now, he was a shadow in the background, waiting for the right moment to step forward and reveal the ugly truths lurking just beneath the surface. As Laura sat in her empty house, the weight of the past few months, years even, came crashing down on her. She thought about the way Mark had grown distant. The conversations that had once been so easy now felt like chores. There was no spark left in their relationship, no passion. It was as though they were living parallel lives but never truly living together. She had tried. God, how she had tried. She had taken on more of the household responsibilities, hoping that would bring them closer. She had taken time off work to surprise him with a romantic getaway, but the spark just wasn't there. And now she understood. The love between them had died, and she had been blind to it. Claire's world was one of constant struggle. As a single mother, she had to juggle work, childcare, and the constant stress of making ends meet. She had no family to help her, no safety net to catch her if she fell. And when Mark entered her life, he seemed like an answer to her prayers. He was charming, generous, and promised her a way out. But as time went on, she started to feel like she was nothing more than an escape for him, a distraction. The guilt gnawed at her, but the pressure of her own life kept her bound to him, the whispers from her friends. "He's married, Claire. You deserve better." Only made her feel more trapped. But she refused to believe it. She needed to believe in the dream Mark had sold her. Mark was always careful. He had to be. The balancing act of maintaining two relationships, one with Laura, the other with Claire, was exhausting, but it was a game he had mastered. He knew how to keep Laura at arm's length, how to pretend everything was fine. And with Claire, he knew how to keep her in the dark, making empty promises of a future that never came. But the cracks were starting to show. Late-night calls that used to be his escape were becoming a problem. His lies were starting to feel thin, even to him. And the more he tried to keep everything under control, the more it seemed to slip through his fingers. One evening, Laura was in the kitchen, putting away dishes when she overheard Mark's voice. It was soft, low, and intimate. He was speaking to someone, but she couldn't make out the words. Her heart skipped. Who was he talking to? She knew it wasn't a business called, there was a tenderness in his voice she hadn't heard in years. She tried to focus on the dishes, but the more she heard, the more she felt her gut twist with unease. When Mark finished the call, he came into the kitchen, his face a mask of casualness. But Laura could see it. Something was off. Who was he talking to? Over the next few days, Laura noticed the subtle changes. He was more distracted than usual. When he spoke, his eyes avoided hers. He was late home from work more often. Laura's stomach twisted with a growing sense of dread. It wasn't just the phone call. It was everything. He's hiding something, she thought, the suspicion blossoming into a gnawing certainty. The unease Laura felt shifted into something more powerful: determination. She knew she couldn't ignore this any longer. She needed answers. She needed to know who Mark had been talking to. The first step was clear. She had to confront him. But Laura knew that this time, she would not be the same person who had been blind to the truth. This time she would find the answers no matter the cost. Laura sat at the kitchen table, the dim light of the lamp casting a shadow across the stack of bills in front of her. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the credit card statements. At first, everything seemed normal. The usual charges, for groceries, utilities, and the occasional dinner. But then, her eyes froze on one particular line. A booking for a luxury hotel in the city, dated 2 weeks ago. The amount was steep, too steep for a weekend getaway. As her breath caught in her throat, Laura flipped through more statements, her heart pounding with each new discovery. Hotel bookings, expensive restaurants, purchases for jewelry. There was no doubt now. Mark had been hiding something. He had been spending money, their money, on someone else. His trips were not for work, as he had claimed. They were for someone he had been seeing behind her back. Laura's eyes blurred with anger and confusion. She needed answers. But this wasn't enough. The evidence, while damning, wasn't conclusive. She needed more. Laura waited for Mark to leave the house the following morning before she went to work. His phone, left carelessly on the kitchen counter, called to her. She'd never been one for snooping. She trusted Mark. Or at least she used to. But now every instinct screamed that she had to know. Her hands felt cold as she unlocked his phone, silently praying that she wouldn't find what she feared. She scrolled through his messages. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then she accessed the deleted folder. Her pulse quickened. Fragments of messages began to appear, short, sweet exchanges that were far too intimate. "Can't wait to see you again," one read. "I miss you," said another. There was a name she didn't recognize. Claire. And a series of texts discussing plans for weekends away, dinner dates, even vacations. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't just an affair. This was a full-blown relationship. Mark had been living a double life, and Laura had been none the wiser. Later that evening, Laura found herself scrolling through Mark's social media history. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but a part of her knew she would find something. It didn't take long. Among the hundreds of posts and photos, one stood out. A tagged picture of Mark, smiling, his arm around a woman. The caption read, "My love, Claire." Laura clicked on the profile, the name now burning in her mind. Claire Miller. The woman who had stolen her husband's heart. She clicked through Claire's photos, selfies, photos of a young child, a little girl, named Emma. Laura's heart twisted. She could see the resemblance. Mark had a child with this woman, a child he hadn't mentioned. She felt the weight of it all, betrayal, loss, rage, all pressing down on her chest. And yet, a part of her was paralyzed with fear. This wasn't just about her marriage anymore. This was about a family. Their family. Mark's secret family. The next day, Laura found herself at a local coffee shop sitting at a table near the window watching Claire from a distance. She had made up her mind. If she couldn't confront Mark yet, then she would confront Claire. She would find out the truth face to face. As Claire ordered her coffee, Laura steeled herself. She approached the counter, standing just a few feet behind her. When Claire turned to walk away, Laura stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I couldn't help but notice. You look familiar. Are you Claire Miller?" Claire turned, her expression wary at first. Then, her face softened and she nodded. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you?" Laura smiled, but it was a thin, strained smile. "I'm a friend of Mark's. I just wanted to say hello. I've heard so much about you." Claire's eyes brightened, clearly flattered. "Oh, Mark's always so sweet about talking about his friends. It's nice to meet you." They exchanged pleasantries, Claire mentioning her daughter Emma and how much Mark adored her. Laura listened, fighting to keep her composure. Inside, a storm raged, but she kept her calm. Mark really had made her believe he was leaving Laura, for her, Laura realized. He told her he was unhappy. He lied to both of us. But as they spoke more, Claire grew warmer, clearly unaware of the storm raging inside Laura. She shared a little too much, talking about how Mark had promised a future, together, a life beyond their secret meetings. Her voice held such hope. Hope that had been fed by lies. After a few minutes, Claire mentioned her daughter. "Would you like to meet Emma?" she asked, her eyes lighting up at the prospect. Laura hesitated, but then nodded. The little girl was in a stroller sitting quietly, with big brown eyes that resembled Mark's. Laura's heart wavered. Emma was innocent in all of this. She had no idea about the tangled web of lies that surrounded her birth. The child smiled at Laura, and for a moment all of the anger in Laura's heart dissolved into something softer. Pity, sympathy. But then the truth crashed back into her mind. Mark was the father of this little girl. He had kept her a secret. And that secret had cost Laura everything. When Mark returned home that evening, Laura couldn't hold back anymore. The words poured out of her like a flood. She confronted him, her voice shaking with fury and hurt. "Who is Claire?" she demanded. "Who is she, Mark? I know everything." Mark's face went pale, but he quickly masked it with a smirk. "What are you talking about?" His tone was dismissive. "You're overthinking things, Laura. There's nothing going on." But Laura wasn't fooled. She could see the cracks in his confident demeanor. The way his hands trembled when he reached for his drink. The way his eyes avoided hers. "Don't lie to me, Mark," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know about Claire. I know about the hotel stays. I know about Emma." Mark exhaled sharply, then reached out for her. "Laura, I never meant for you to find out like this. You're just overreacting." He pulled her into his arms, trying to calm her down, but the touch felt hollow. "Don't touch me," Laura snapped, pulling away from him. "Don't you dare." In the days that followed, Mark switched tactics. He tried to charm his way back into her good graces, buying her flowers, sending sweet texts, planning intimate dinners. But Laura wasn't fooled. His gestures were empty, designed to calm her suspicions, to make her doubt her own instincts. "You know I love you," Mark said, holding her face gently in his hands one evening. "You're everything to me. Don't let this tear us apart." But Laura felt a coldness in his touch now. The words didn't reach her anymore. He had lost her trust, and no amount of charm could win it back. That night, as Laura lay awake in bed, she replayed everything in her mind. Mark had told Claire that he was trapped in an unhappy marriage, that he wanted to be with her. But it was all lies. Manipulation. He had told Claire whatever she wanted to hear to keep her in his life, just as he had done with Laura all these years. But now, the facade was crumbling. Laura could see it. The man who had carefully woven his two worlds together was beginning to unravel, and soon the truth would come to light. Laura's emotions were a hurricane. Anger, sorrow, betrayal, and a deep sense of loss washed over her in waves. Every corner of the house reminded her of the lies Mark had told. Every picture, every gift, every smile. She felt hollow, as though a piece of her soul had been ripped out. She couldn't keep living this lie. Not anymore. Ellie was the only person Laura could trust now. She spoke to her on the phone, her voice trembling as she recounted everything she had learned. "Laura," Ellie said cautiously, "you need to be careful. Don't rush into anything. This is bigger than you think." But Laura was beyond reason. The rage in her chest couldn't be contained anymore. "He's betrayed me, Ellie. Both of us. I need to do something. I can't just sit here and wait." Laura knew she wasn't ready to confront Mark yet. Not without more evidence, not without more of the truth in her hands. But it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. She had a plan now. She would gather the evidence she needed and then expose him for the liar he truly was. Then, Laura discovered the final blow. Their joint savings, the account they had built together, was almost empty. Mark had been funneling money to Claire, giving her the financial support she needed, while Laura remained in the dark. Laura's heart shattered as she realized the depth of the betrayal. Not only had Mark cheated on her, but he had also drained their finances, leaving her vulnerable. Laura knew what she had to do. It was time for a confrontation. She had to end this, for good. She would no longer be a passive player in Mark's lies. It was time to take control of her life again, and that meant confronting Mark with the truth. A storm was brewing, and it was going to be a battle neither of them could escape. Laura sat at the kitchen table, her mind racing. She had been planning this moment for weeks, carefully crafting a strategy to finally expose Mark for who he truly was. It wasn't enough to confront him alone. She needed him to face the consequences of his actions, to look both Claire and herself in the eye and answer for the lies that had torn their lives apart. She could almost hear Mark's voice in her head, calm and confident, trying to manipulate her into believing his promises. He was always so good at that. She tapped her fingers on the table, then picked up her phone. After a few minutes of silence, she composed the message. "Claire, I know you're hurt, and so am I. But we need to talk about Mark. I'm inviting you to a cabin this weekend, just the three of us. I believe it's time to face the truth and put everything on the table. Please come." Laura read the message twice before pressing send. She had to lure Claire into this web of truth. Once she arrived, there would be no turning back. The cabin was isolated, nestled deep in the woods, a place far from the prying eyes of their usual lives. The walls were thick, the air stifling with tension, as though even the trees outside knew what was coming. Laura had chosen it carefully, a quiet, inescapable space where secrets could no longer hide. Laura sat by the window, looking out at the dense forest. Her heart hammered in her chest. She had played this role before, the patient wife, the trusting partner. But this time, she was playing for keeps. When Mark and Claire arrived, everything would change. She heard the gravel crunch under tires, signaling their arrival. It was time. Mark stepped out of the car, his smile wide, though there was a tightness around his eyes that Laura could see from the window. He didn't know what was coming. He was too confident, too sure of himself. This wasn't the first time. He'd been in a situation like this, but this time he wasn't in control. "Laura," He greeted her with a soft laugh, his usual charm masking the tension in his voice. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I see you've made this place cozy. He leaned in to kiss her on the cheek, but she recoiled, her coldness palpable. Thanks for coming, Mark, Laura said flatly, her tone clipped. Behind him, Claire stepped out of the car, clutching her purse to her chest. She looked unsure, as though she couldn't decide if she was in the right place or not. Mark caught her eye, offering a reassuring smile, but it faltered when Claire's gaze darted nervously between them. Laura watched them both. She could see the hope in Claire's eyes, but she also noticed the doubt that crept in. Claire wasn't as sure of Mark as he thought. I don't know about this, Claire whispered to Mark as they walked toward the cabin, her voice tinged with doubt. What's this all about, really? Mark's face softened as he took her hand, his voice soothing. Don't worry, Laura just wants to clear the air. We'll figure this out, I promise. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of guilt that Claire didn't miss. She wanted to believe him, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. She had hoped for so long that Mark would keep his promises, that he would leave Laura for her. But something was off. The air felt heavy with unspoken truths. They entered the cabin, and Claire took in the rustic charm of the space, but the warmth of the setting couldn't settle the growing pit in her stomach. Laura didn't waste any time. She stepped forward, her posture rigid, her voice steady but sharp. I think it's time we all had an honest conversation. Mark looked taken aback. What are you? Shut up, Mark, Laura interrupted, her eyes burning with rage. I've had enough of your lies. She pulled a manila envelope from the table and opened it. The DNA test results stared back at them. This, she said, holding it up, proves you're Emma's father. You lied to her just like you lied to me. But it gets worse. She tossed the envelope aside and then pulled out a set of bank statements. I found these in your email. You've been draining our savings, sending money to Claire while I was paying all of our bills. How long did you think you could hide it? Mark's face turned white. Laura, please. I can explain. But Laura was done listening. She wasn't going to let him manipulate this moment, not this time. The truth is, Mark, she said coldly, you don't love either of us. You never did. You love yourself. Claire stood frozen, her face a mix of confusion and shock. The revelation hit her like a slap, the weight of Mark's lies crashing down on her. Claire's voice cracked as she turned to Mark, her words laced with disbelief. You told me you were going to leave her. You said we had a future. Her hands trembled as she reached for her purse, clutching it tightly. How could you do this? How could you make me believe all those things? Mark's eyes shifted between Laura and Claire, panic flickering in his eyes. It's not like that, Claire. I never meant for you to find out like this. But Claire wasn't listening anymore. The truth was too much. The pain, the humiliation, was too much to bear. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes as she turned away from Mark. You manipulated me, she whispered, her voice breaking. All along, I was just another one of your lies. Mark's composure crumbled. His voice cracked as he reached out to Laura, his hands shaking. Laura, please, I know I've made mistakes, but you can't just end this. I'll fix it. Just give me a chance. I love you. You have to believe me. Laura stared at him, her expression cold and unyielding. No, Mark, you don't get to fix this. You don't get to fix anything. It's too late. Mark took a step back, his face contorted with desperation. I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry. Please, Laura, don't leave me. I'll change. But Laura had heard all of it before. The lies, the promises, the manipulations. This was the end, the Tension in the room reached its breaking point. Mark's anger surged. You think you're so much better than me? You think I don't have feelings? You did this to me. You pushed me to Claire. This is your fault too. Laura's eyes narrowed. Her fists clenched. You're sick, Mark. You've destroyed everything and now you want to blame me? You're overdramatic, Laura. You think you can control everything, but you can't. The words spat from his mouth, venomous and cutting. Claire backed away, her hands trembling at her sides. She was no longer part of this. She was just a witness to Mark's unraveling. Mark lunged at Laura in a burst of rage, his hands grasping for her. Laura didn't hesitate. She pushed him away with all the force she could muster. In the chaos of the moment, Mark lost his balance. His body careened toward the fireplace, and with a sickening thud, his head struck the edge. Laura froze. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched Mark crumple to the ground. Blood pooled beneath his head, and for a moment, she didn't know if he was still alive. His body was limp, his face pale. Mark? She whispered, her voice trembling. She took a hesitant step toward him, reaching out with shaking hands. She pressed her fingers against his neck, searching for a pulse. He was breathing, shallow and weak. She exhaled in relief, but the terror still gripped her chest. What had she just done? Shaking, Laura picked up her phone and dialed 911. Hello? I need help. There's been a domestic dispute. My husband. He fell. He hit his head. Her voice was calm, eerily so as she spoke into the phone, but inside her mind was spinning. As the sirens wailed in the distance, Laura stood frozen, waiting for the consequences of her actions to come crashing down. Everything she had planned, everything she had fought for, it was all unraveling now. The storm had come, and it would change everything. Mark sat in the sterile hospital room, his head throbbing with the faint remnants of the blow that had nearly ended his life. The soft hum of medical equipment filled the silence as he gazed at the ceiling, lost in thought. His once steady hands were now wrapped in bandages, the aftermath of a confrontation that had spiraled into something far beyond his control. He had survived, barely. But that was the only victory left in his life. The doctors had warned him, a mild brain injury. It wasn't severe, but the consequences of his actions would be. As his mind cleared from the fog of the injury, the reality of what he had done began to sink in. His marriage, his affair, his betrayal, it was all laid bare. Laura's cold expression haunted him, her final words echoing in his head. You don't love either of us. You love yourself. His body ached, but it was his conscience that tortured him most. He had tried to control everything, to manipulate his way out of situations, but this time it wasn't working. The wreckage he'd caused was too vast to escape. Weeks later, the authorities arrived at Mark's doorstep, armed with the damning evidence Laura had provided. They had all the proof they needed: bank statements, documents, and receipts outlining his theft from both Laura and Claire. Mark's once unshakable confidence had eroded, replaced by a quiet desperation. Laura stood outside, watching as Mark was led away in handcuffs. The sting of victory was bitter in her mouth, but it was justice. The financial fraud that had been years in the making had finally caught up with him. No amount of apologies or begging could undo the damage he had caused. The officers gave her a brief nod as they passed, and she turned away without saying a word. She didn't need to. Everything she had fought for had come to fruition, but it didn't make the emptiness in her chest go away. While Mark's legal troubles escalated, Claire was moving forward with her own fight. She filed a paternity suit to secure financial support for her daughter, Emma, She knew it wasn't just about money. It was about accountability, about making Mark take responsibility for the lies and the life he had destroyed. But there was no more room for emotional connection with him. Claire had severed all personal ties to Mark, her heart hardened by the reality of how deeply he had manipulated her. She no longer cared about his pleas for forgiveness or his broken promises. All she wanted was security for her daughter, and to put the past behind her. News of Mark's actions didn't stay hidden for long. The story hit the local news, and before long, everyone from his colleagues to his neighbors knew the truth. His reputation, once that of a well-respected man, crumbled under the weight of the scandal. People who had once looked up to him now whispered behind his back, unsure of how to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster who had betrayed everyone close to him. Laura and Claire became part of the story too. The scandal spread like wildfire, and the community that had once embraced Mark now found themselves grappling with the shocking betrayal. The whispers followed Laura wherever she went. She heard them, but she didn't care. She had lived in his shadow for too long. Now she was reclaiming her life, and no amount of gossip could hold her back. It wasn't long before Laura finalized her divorce. The paperwork was simple. Mark had nothing left to offer her, and there was no reason to delay the inevitable. Signing the final papers felt like closing a door on a life she had once hoped for, but was now eager to leave behind. She stood in front of her bedroom mirror that evening, her reflection staring back at her with quiet resolve. The woman in the mirror was someone she no longer recognized. She was stronger, wiser, broken, yes, but unshakable. Her independence felt like freedom. It wasn't the life she had envisioned, but it was her life now, and she was determined to rebuild it. Even as Laura moved forward, guilt weighed heavily on her. The confrontation had been necessary, but the violence that followed haunted her. She had never imagined things would go so far, never thought that a simple push would lead to Mark's fall. The image of his crumpled body would stay with her forever, but therapy gave her the space to process it all. Week after week, she spoke about the trauma of the past, about her marriage, her betrayal, the decisions she had made. Slowly, she began to understand that the guilt she carried wasn't hers to bear. She had done what needed to be done. The rest was out of her hands. Her therapist often told her, "Healing is not about erasing what happened. It's about finding peace within it." And for the first time in months, Laura felt like she was finding that peace. Through it all, Ellie remained by Laura's side. Her best friend had been a constant source of support during the darkest moments, helping Laura navigate the overwhelming emotions that came with rebuilding her life. Ellie had listened without judgment, offered advice when needed, and, most importantly, made sure Laura knew she wasn't alone. "I know you don't need to hear this, but you're doing the right thing," Ellie said one afternoon as they sat together on Laura's new couch, the house finally beginning to feel like home. "You're free now, and you've got the whole world ahead of you." Laura smiled faintly, her eyes tired but hopeful. "I don't know if I believe that yet, but I want to." As for Claire, she made the decision to leave everything behind. She packed up her life, her daughter Emma in tow, and moved to a new city. It wasn't about escaping, it was about finding a fresh start. A place where Mark's betrayal wouldn't follow her, where she could rebuild a stable and happy life for her daughter, away from the shadow of his lies. "I want a life where I don't have to look over my shoulder anymore," Claire confessed to Laura one last time before she left. "Emma deserves better than what he gave us." Laura nodded, her eyes softening. "You're doing the right thing, Claire. For you. For Emma." Claire spent many quiet evenings reflecting on the past, on the ways she had been manipulated by Mark. She had been vulnerable, seeking love and validation, and he had preyed on that. But she had learned, and that was all that mattered now. I won't be fooled again, she whispered to herself, her resolve hardening. She would never let someone like Mark take advantage of her again. Emma's future depended on it. As the days passed, Claire found herself embracing a new chapter. She enrolled in a career training program, determined to make her own way. She spent evenings with Emma, reading her favorite stories, building memories of stability and love. It wasn't easy, but it was real. Claire smiled down at her daughter, one evening, her heart swelling with pride. Emma was the reason Claire had found the strength to move forward, and together they were unstoppable. With every passing day, Claire felt a little more at peace. The future was hers to reclaim. The sound of rain against the window pane echoed in the empty room, matching the storm inside Laura's mind. She stood by the bed, the place where she and Mark once shared dreams, plans, and false promises. Now it was just an echo of the past, and as she surveyed the room, she couldn't escape the weight of the betrayal that had shattered her life. Betrayal. It clung to her, even in the quiet moments when she thought she could breathe again. Mark had lied, manipulated, and stolen from her. He had played the part of the loving husband while quietly plotting to break her. But the truth was more than just his affair. It was everything he had kept hidden, everything he had done under the surface. Why didn't I see it? Her mind spiraled back to the confrontation in the cabin, to the moment when she had faced him with the evidence. Mark had begged, pleaded, promising to change, to make things right. But there was no going back. Not after the lies, not after the manipulation. She had stood there, strong and resolute, as the man who had once promised to love her crumbled before her. The pain was still there, lingering, but it was different now. It no longer consumed her. She had done what needed to be done. She had taken control, even when every part of her wanted to let it slide, wanted to believe the lies for just a little longer. But that woman, the one who had clung to hope, had died in that moment, and the woman standing in the mirror now was stronger, hardened by the truth. I'm not the same anymore. Guilt, though, was a constant companion. Could she have done things differently? Could she have handled the confrontation with more grace? The thought of the violence that had occurred haunted her, Mark's body crumpling to the ground after she pushed him. She hadn't meant to hurt him. But the heat of the moment, the desperation to stop his manipulation, it had consumed her. The question lingered. Did she go too far? But in time, she realized it wasn't about absolution. She hadn't crossed a line. She had simply defended herself, defended her life. The guilt was just another burden she had to release. She had faced the truth, and in doing so, she had freed herself. The question of forgiveness was never far from her mind. Could she forgive Mark for everything he had done? For the lies, the manipulation, the cold betrayal? She had spent days contemplating it, but she came to a realization. Forgiveness wasn't something she owed him. It was something she needed for herself. Forgiveness, she realized, had to start with forgiving herself. For staying in the toxic relationship, for ignoring the red flags, for putting Mark's needs above her own for so long. She had allowed herself to be swallowed up by his world, but not anymore. She could forgive, but she didn't need to forget. Her healing began with putting herself first, something she had never truly done before. Her needs, her well-being, came above everything else now. The thought didn't feel selfish, it felt like freedom. I can't keep living for someone else. Not anymore. The sun had just begun to set, casting a soft glow on the boxes scattered around the apartment. Laura moved methodically, each item she packed a symbol of letting go. The life she had shared with Mark felt like a distant memory now, one that had been boxed up, sealed, and ready to be put away for good. As she folded the last of her clothes into a suitcase, her hands trembled, not from fear, but from anticipation. She was ready to leave it all behind. Her eyes scanned the room one last time. The bed, the broken furniture, the walls that had once held secrets and lies. It had all been a dream that had long since turned into a nightmare. But now, it was over. As she zipped the suitcase shut, she took a deep breath. She could almost hear Mark's voice in her head, the way he had pleaded for another chance, the way he had tried to convince her that everything could go back to the way it was. But she was done listening to lies. She walked toward the door, her hand on the knob, and paused for just a moment. A faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips. It wasn't a smile of joy, but one of relief, of finally taking control, of finally stepping into the unknown with nothing but her own strength to guide her. This is my new beginning. With a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped outside. The world beyond was unfamiliar, full of possibility and uncertainty, but she was no longer afraid. She had her freedom, her peace, and most importantly, she had herself. The journey ahead was hers to define. As the door closed behind her, she let the quiet weight of the past fall away, leaving only the faintest trace of hope. A hope for the future, a future built on her terms, where she could thrive and reclaim everything that had been taken from her. And with that, she smiled once more, embracing the life that was finally hers to live.